The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as James Wilson adjusted his perfectly polished boots. The weight of the bearskin cap felt familiar after all these years, a reminder of everything he'd worked for. The traditional red uniform, which he'd dreamed of wearing since childhood, now fit him like a second skin. Standing at his post, James couldn't help but smile inside as he watched the early morning tourists begin to gather. Children pointed excitedly, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of the famous Queen's Guard. He remembered being just like them, pressing his face against these same gates 25 years ago, dreaming of one day wearing this uniform. The journey hadn't been easy. Growing up in a small town outside London, James had faced plenty of doubters. The Queen's Guard. His career counselor had laughed. Maybe aim for something more realistic. But James's mother had taught him better than to listen to those who would limit his dreams. You can be anything, she'd always said, as long as you're willing to work twice as hard for it. And work he did. 15 years of service, countless hours of training, and a dedication that earned him respect among his fellow guardsmen. Now, at 35, he was one of the most experienced members of the Guard, often mentoring newcomers on the finer points of ceremonial duty. The morning crowd grew larger as tour buses arrived, bringing visitors from all corners of the world. James maintained his famous stillness, perfected through years of practice. His eyes scanned the crowd professionally, noting the usual mix of excited children, curious adults, and amateur photographers trying to capture the perfect shot. A group of schoolchildren gathered nearby, their teacher explaining the history of the palace and the Guard. James could hear their whispered questions. Does he ever move? Is he really guarding the Queen? How long does he stand there? These were the moments he loved most, inspiring the next generation, showing them that tradition and progress could stand side by side. The sun climbed higher, warming the heavy wool uniform. James had learned long ago how to handle the discomfort, turning it into a meditation of sorts. His mind wandered to his own daughter, who often bragged to her friends about her dad's important job. "My daddy protects the Queen," she'd say proudly, not fully understanding that her father was breaking barriers just by standing here. A light breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from the palace gardens, mixing with the urban sounds of London. Tourist photos continued to flash, and James maintained his stoic expression, though his chest swelled with pride. Each click of a camera captured more than just a man in uniform. It captured progress, determination, and the changing face of British tradition. The morning wore on, and James noticed a particularly boisterous group approaching his post. Years of experience had taught him to read crowds well, and something about this group's energy felt different. He squared his shoulders imperceptibly, preparing himself for whatever might come. After all, handling the unexpected was part of what made him good at his job. Little did he know that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. The next few minutes would test not just his training, but everything he stood for as a guardian of one of Britain's most cherished institutions. As the group drew closer, James remained perfectly still, embodying the discipline and dignity that had become second nature to him over his years of service. Through it all, his mother's words echoed in his mind: "Stand tall, stand proud, and let your actions speak louder than words." Those words had guided him through training, through doubts, and through every challenge. They would serve him well in the moments to come, though he didn't know it yet. The tourist group that had caught James's attention moved closer to his post, their voices carrying across the courtyard. Among them was a man who stood out immediately, not because of his expensive camera or designer clothes, but because of the way he carried himself, with an air of entitled superiority that experienced guards learned to spot from miles away. The man, who looked to be in his 50s, was speaking loudly to his companions, his American accent cutting through the general murmur of the crowd. "I've been to London 6 times, he boasted, adjusting his Panama hat. "But things sure have changed since my last visit." His eyes fixed on James with an expression that made several nearby tourists shift uncomfortably. A young couple from Canada, who had been peacefully taking photos, stepped aside as the man pushed forward, his camera swinging from his neck. The morning sun caught the lens, creating a brief flash that would have made a less trained guard blink. But James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward, his posture immaculate. "Hey, look at this," the man called out to his group, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. They're letting anyone wear the uniform these days. He raised his camera, not to take a respectful photo like the other tourists, but almost as if he were documenting something he found wrong with the scene before him. The crowd around them began to thin out, creating an uncomfortable bubble of space. Parents pulled their children closer, some shooting disapproving looks at the loud American. Two teenage girls who had been taking selfies lowered their phones, their expressions changing from joy to concern as they sensed the shifting atmosphere. "I mean, really," the man continued, his voice growing louder with each word, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. "When I was here in the 90s, the guards were all, well, you know what I mean." He looked around, seemingly expecting support from the other tourists, but found only uncomfortable glances and turned backs. James maintained his composure, his training serving him well. Behind his stoic expression, he thought about all the others who had stood at this post before him, generations of guards who had maintained their dignity in the face of far worse than an ignorant tourist. His father's words came back to him, "Your uniform represents something bigger than any one person's small-mindedness." The man moved closer, nearly crossing the regulatory boundary that tourists were supposed to maintain. His camera clicked rapidly, the sound somehow more aggressive than the hundreds of other tourist photos taken that day. "I should write to someone about this," he announced to no one in particular. "This is about tradition, you know. Some things shouldn't change." Other tourists had begun recording the scene on their phones, though not for the usual reasons people filmed the Queen's Guard. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something unprecedented was unfolding. A group of British schoolchildren on a field trip watched with wide eyes, their teacher whispering something to them about respect and dignity. Through it all, James remained motionless, his eyes forward, his bearing perfect. Each second of his training clicked into place like well-oiled gears, the breathing techniques that kept him calm, the mental focus that helped him maintain his stance, the pride in his uniform that ran deeper than any surface-level judgment. The morning sun continued its climb, the shadows shifting around them, but the moment seemed frozen in time. Other guards at their posts could sense the situation unfolding, their peripheral vision catching glimpses of the scene. The tourists' words hung in the air like heavy smoke, about to be blown away by an unexpected wind of change that none of them could yet see coming. The weight of James's bearskin cap felt heavier with each passing moment, but his training held firm. Inside his mind, he thought about his first day of guard training, when his instructor had taught them about maintaining composure. "Your stillness is your strength," the old sergeant had said. Those words echoed now, more meaningful than ever. The morning heat began to build, and a bead of sweat traced its way down James's back beneath the thick wool uniform. Still, he didn't move. The tourists' words continued to fill the air, but James focused on the little things around him. The flutter of a Union Jack in the breeze, the distant sound of London traffic, the whispered conversations of disapproving onlookers. A young boy in the crowd tugged at his mother's sleeve, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "Mom, why is that man so angry at the soldier?" The innocent question hung in the air, making several adults shift uncomfortably. The tourist paused briefly, perhaps hearing the child's words, but then continued his tirade with renewed energy. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching out like honey dripping from a spoon. James thought about his own son at home, who always asked for bedtime stories about Daddy's job guarding the palace. What story would he tell about today? Perhaps about how strength sometimes means standing still when everything inside you wants to move. The tourist's face had grown redder, his words becoming more frustrated as James maintained his professional silence. "Don't they even talk?" he demanded of no one in particular. "Back in my day, the guards at least looked like they belonged here." His camera clicked again, the sound sharp and angry in the morning air. Behind James's stoic expression, memories floated through his mind. His grandfather's proud smile when he'd first earned his uniform, his mother sewing on his patches with tears in her eyes, his wife straightening his collar each morning before duty. These thoughts were his armor, stronger than any uniform. Other tourists had formed a loose circle around the scene, their phones recording quietly. An elderly British woman in a floral dress shook her head slowly, her disapproval evident in every line of her face. A group of American students whispered among themselves, clearly embarrassed by their countrymen's behavior. The morning sun caught the breast buttons on James's uniform, sending little flashes of light across the courtyard. He focused on his breathing, slow and steady, just as he'd been taught. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Each breath was a reminder of his purpose here, not just to guard the palace, but to represent something greater than himself. A pair of pigeons landed nearby, completely unfazed by the human drama unfolding around them. James watched them from the corner of his eye, envying their simple existence for a moment. The tourists' words had become background noise now, like the distant rumble of London buses or the chatter of other visitors. Throughout his years of service, James had faced his share of challenges, but this was different. This wasn't about physical endurance or military precision, it was about dignity. His father's words came back to him, "Your silence can speak louder than any words." Right now, his silence was telling a story about professionalism, about duty, about rising above pettiness. The tourist's reflection was visible in the polished brass of a nearby railing, his gestures becoming more animated as his audience remained unresponsive to his attempts to provoke reaction. James stood firm, his shadow on the courtyard stones as steady as the palace itself behind him. In this moment, he wasn't just a guard. He was a mirror, reflecting back the true nature of prejudice for all to see. The moment that changed everything came from the most unexpected source. A little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, wearing a bright yellow raincoat despite the clear sky, had been watching the whole scene unfold with growing confusion. She stood with her mother near the front of the crowd, her small hand clutching a stuffed corgi toy. "Mummy," she said, her clear voice carrying across the tense atmosphere like a bell, "why is that man being so mean to the soldier?" The simple question cut through the tourist's rant like a knife through butter. Several people in the crowd turned to look at the child, then back at the tourist, seeing the situation with fresh eyes. The tourist's flow of words stuttered to a halt for a moment, caught off guard by the pure innocence of the question. In that brief silence, the little girl continued, "The soldier looks very smart in his uniform. I want to be a guard too when I grow up." Her mother squeezed her hand, pride and embarrassment mixing on her face. A gentle breeze rustled through the courtyard, carrying the sweet scent of nearby flowers. James remained perfectly still, but he felt something shift in the atmosphere around him. The little girl's words had somehow managed to do what no amount of adult disapproval had achieved. They had held up a mirror to the absurdity of the situation. An older gentleman in the crowd cleared his throat and spoke up, his London accent thick with emotion. "You know, miss," he said to the little girl, though his eyes were fixed on the tourist, "these guards are chosen because they're the very best. Each one of them has earned their place here, protecting our queen and our traditions." The tourist's camera hung limply around his neck now forgotten. His face had taken on a different kind of redness, not from anger this time, but from something that looked a lot like shame. A group of teenagers who had been recording the scene on their phones slowly lowered their devices, the moment feeling too personal somehow to capture. The little girl nodded seriously at the old man's words, then looked back at James with undisguised admiration. "He's standing so still," she whispered loudly to her mother. "Like a real-life toy soldier, but better." A few gentle chuckles rippled through the crowd, breaking the tension further. James maintained his position, but he could feel the pride swelling in his chest. Not pride for himself, but for this moment, for this little girl who saw past everything but the uniform and the duty it represented. Her innocent words had accomplished what no amount of regulation or authority could have done. The morning sun had climbed higher now, casting shorter shadows across the palace courtyard. More tourists were gathering, drawn by the unusual atmosphere, but the mood had shifted completely. The earlier hostility had evaporated like morning dew, replaced by something warmer, more thoughtful. Parents in the crowd were now quietly explaining to their children about respect, about duty, about judging people by their actions and not their appearance. The tourist stood awkwardly at the edge of the group, his earlier bravado deflated by the wisdom of a child. His companions had drifted away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The little girl had started telling her mother about how she would practice standing still at home, just like the guard, making her mother smile. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and other children in the crowd began to mimic James's stance, standing as straight as they could with serious expressions on their faces. It was a powerful reminder that children often see the world more clearly than adults, unclouded by prejudice or preconception. The crowd's reaction spread like ripples in a pond after a stone's throw. The British grandmother, who had been watching with increasing displeasure, finally stepped forward. She wore a neat blue cardigan and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen enough of life to know when to speak up. "Young man," she addressed the tourist, her voice carrying the kind of authority that only decades of life experience can give, "I've been coming to this palace for over 60 years. I was here when they changed the guard during the coronation, and I can tell you something about tradition." She paused, making sure she had everyone's attention. The tourist shifted uncomfortably, his expensive camera now hanging uselessly around his neck. The grandmother continued, her voice firm but not unkind. "Tradition isn't about keeping things exactly the same. It's about preserving what's best about our past while welcoming what's good about our future. And that young man," she gestured toward James, "represents the very best of both." Other voices began to join in, like instruments adding to an orchestra. A young teacher who had brought her class to see the palace spoke up. "Children," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "this is what real dignity looks like. Standing tall and proud, doing your duty no matter what." Her students nodded, some taking notes in their little books. An American couple, clearly mortified by their countryman's behavior, stepped forward. "We're from Boston," the wife said, her accent similar to the tourists', "and we want you to know that he doesn't speak for all of us. We're honored to see your traditions being carried forward by people who truly understand their meaning." The crowd had grown larger now, with newcomers being quietly filled in on what had happened. Phones were recording, not to capture conflict anymore, but to document something unexpected and heartwarming. The atmosphere had transformed from tension to something that felt almost like a celebration of unity. A group of international students began sharing stories about similar changes in their own country's traditions. A young woman from India talked about female fighter pilots, while a man from Japan described how his country's ancient tea ceremony was being preserved by people from all walks of life. Through it all, James maintained his position, but the sun caught the slightest uplift at the corner of his mouth, the closest a Queen's Guard could come to a smile while on duty. The warmth of the crowd's support felt better than any official commendation he'd ever received. The tourist's friends had melted away into the crowd, leaving him standing alone. His face had gone from red to pale, then to a shade of embarrassed pink. He looked smaller somehow, as if the grandeur he tried to claim for himself had deflated, leaving just a man who'd made a mistake in front of a lot of witnesses. Parents were using the moment as a teaching opportunity. "See," one father whispered to his son, "that's what real strength looks like. Not in being loud or mean, but in staying true to your duty and your principles." The boy nodded solemnly, his eyes fixed on James's immaculate uniform and proud stance. The little girl who had started it all was still there, now pretending to march in place like a god herself. Her joy and innocence had sparked something in the crowd, a reminder that the best traditions are those that grow stronger by including everyone who is willing to uphold them with honor and dignity. Palace security had been watching the situation unfold from a distance, their trained eyes noting every detail. Two officers, wearing dark suits and earpieces, approached the scene with practiced calm. They moved through the crowd like water, professional but not threatening, their presence alone changing the atmosphere once again. The first officer, an older man with gray temples and kind eyes, positioned himself near the tourist. "Sir," he said quietly, "I need to speak with you about your behavior today." His voice was low and controlled, meant only for the tourist's ears, though nearby visitors couldn't help but lean in slightly to listen. The tourist's demeanor had completely changed from his earlier aggression. His shoulders slumped, and his expensive camera hung forgotten around his neck. The second security officer, a younger woman with a clipboard, was already taking notes and gathering statements from nearby witnesses who had recorded the incident on their phones. I didn't mean to cause trouble," the tourist stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The contrast between his current state and his earlier bravado was striking. The security officer nodded patiently, then gestured toward a quiet corner of the courtyard. "Let's discuss this somewhere more private, sir." As they led the tourist away, the crowd's attention turned back to James, who had maintained his perfect posture throughout the entire incident. People began approaching him with a new kind of respect, taking photos not as a tourist attraction, but as a symbol of dignity under pressure. A group of schoolchildren who had witnessed everything asked their teacher if they could write about what they'd seen for their class project. "I think that's an excellent idea," their teacher said, her eyes bright with approval. "This is the kind of history that doesn't make it into textbooks, but should." The British grandmother who had spoken up earlier was now talking to a small group of tourists, explaining the history of the Queen's Guard. "You see," she said, pointing to James's uniform, "every button, every stripe has meaning. But the most important thing that uniform represents is duty, duty that doesn't care about what someone looks like, only about their dedication and skill." The little girl in the yellow raincoat was still there with her mother, now joined by other children who were all trying to stand as still as James. Their parents watched with proud smiles, taking photos of their children's attempts at guard duty. The scene had transformed from one of tension to one of joy and learning. The security officers returned briefly to take a few more statements. The younger officer paused near James's post, speaking quietly into her radio. Though the words weren't audible to the crowd, the slight nod she gave in James's direction suggested that his superiors would be hearing about his exemplary conduct. Tourists who had just arrived were being filled in on what had happened by others in the crowd. Each retelling of the story seemed to carry a new lesson, a new perspective. An elderly veteran in the crowd wiped his eyes, mumbling something about proper soldiering to anyone who would listen. The morning had grown warmer, but the atmosphere in the courtyard had completely changed from the tense confrontation earlier. There was a sense of community among the visitors now, strangers from different countries sharing their thoughts about what they'd witnessed. Some were even exchanging contact information, promising to share the photos and videos they'd taken. By evening, the video of the incident had spread across social media like wildfire. People from around the world were sharing it, not for the conflict, but for the powerful message it carried about dignity, duty, and changing times. The comments section filled with stories from people sharing their own experiences of standing tall in the face of prejudice. James finished his shift as the sun began to set, the changing of the guard ceremony carried out with its usual precision. In the guardroom, his fellow guardsmen greeted him with quiet nods of respect. His commanding officer, a veteran of 30 years' service, called him into the office. "You did us proud today, Wilson," the officer said, his usual formal tone softened with genuine appreciation. On his desk lay printed copies of emails that had already started pouring in from visitors who had witnessed the incident. "The palace has received hundreds of messages about how you handled yourself out there." Walking home that evening, James noticed people looking at him differently. A shopkeeper he passed every day gave him a thumbs up. A group of teenagers recognized him and asked for a photo, not because he was a guard, but because of how he had handled himself during the incident. At home, his wife was already reading the supportive messages flooding social media. "You're trending, love," she said with a proud smile, showing him her phone. Their children crowded around, excited to see their father being called a hero online, though they didn't fully understand why. The tourist, as it turned out, had done some serious thinking after being escorted from the palace grounds. That evening, he posted a lengthy public apology on his social media accounts. "Today, I learned what real tradition looks like," he wrote. "It's not about keeping things the same, it's about preserving what matters while growing as a society. I was wrong, and I'm grateful for the lesson I learned from the guard's dignity and the crowd's response." News outlets picked up the story, not for its controversy, but for its powerful message. A local paper ran the headline, "Dignity in the Face of Prejudice. Queen's Guard Shows True Meaning of Tradition." The article featured interviews with visitors who had witnessed the scene, including the British grandmother who had spoken up. The little girl in the yellow raincoat became a minor celebrity in her own right. Her innocent question had sparked a movement, with parents sharing stories of how their own children were now asking important questions about respect and fairness. Her mother received invitations for her daughter to speak at school assemblies about standing up to unfairness. Back at the palace, the incident became a teaching moment for new guards in training. The instructor used it as an example of how stillness can be stronger than action and how dignity under pressure represents the highest form of service. James was asked to speak to the new recruits, though he kept his words simple. "The uniform isn't just about tradition," he told them. It's about being worthy of what it represents. Several weeks later, a package arrived at the palace for James. Inside was a handmade card from a class of primary school students who had been there that day. They had drawn pictures of him standing at his post, surrounded by messages of thanks and admiration. Their teacher had added a note: "Thank you for teaching our children what real strength looks like." The story continued to have ripples long after the incident. Tourist guides began including it in their tales of palace history, pointing out the spot where it happened. More importantly, it sparked conversations in homes and schools about tradition, respect, and the true meaning of service. James had shown that sometimes the quietest stance can speak the loudest truth.